New linguistic features beget new learning activities. This is a mantra I've been working with for quite some time, and in this video I will demonstrate how many of these new linguistic features that we are finding, especially through corpus work, provide inspiration for new types of learning activities. This presentation was originally given for EuroCALL, for the CorpusCALL SIG within EuroCALL on the 25th of June 2021, and on the web page mentioned here, which will also be mentioned at the end of the presentation, all of the links to the sources mentioned during this video. We're interested here in data-driven learning. What is data, however? Well, the cosmos is a source of data for astronomers. The actions and behavior of politicians are sources of data for journalists and psychologists and spies. And animal tissue is a source of data for biologists. And for linguists, text is a source of data. And from text we have authentic language. You might like to consider what inauthentic language is and what is learning driven by data. So this is what we will explore here. Tim Johns is known as the father of data-driven learning. He was from Birmingham University, and his work on data-driven learning has inspired a great deal of work ever since. Now, when we're talking about data sources, then obviously we're talking about observation. And when we observe things, sometimes we find things which are unique, like a 42-leaf clover or a virgin birth, which is something I heard about on the radio recently. An aquatic mammal that lays eggs, that's pretty unique, or a hapax legomenon, which is a word which is only used once, either in the language or in a very large sample of the language. So all of these scientists have their tools, and what we look for is, well, while unique things are interesting, what we're really looking for is things which are repeated in the data, because things which are repeated in the data become patterns. So, for example, for astronomers, they observe the movement of asteroids and moons and planets, the blood temperature of animals observed by by biologists, typical behavior of corrupt politicians, and what we're interested in here is the behavior of words, phrases, and structures. Now, when you have patterns, the very interesting thing about patterns is that they are visible. You can see here in these 5 or 6 excerpts from the sketch engine that these language patterns are visible, and this is very different from a rule. When the patterns are expressed in graphs and tables, as they are in the Longman grammar of spoken and written English, we see things like this. Now, what patterns enable us to do is predict the behavior. And this is as true for astronomers, because they can tell us in advance when the next eclipse will be, for example. It happens with animal behavior, with psychologists. Journalists and spies who are looking at politicians like to be able to predict their behavior. So in language, we like to predict behavior as well, because these patterns of normal usage are the things which our students need to know so that their language sounds normal and standard. So these typical things that we find, these patterns of normal usage, these are in statistics terms known as the mode. These 3 grammar books here on the left, these have all been written in the last 20 or so years, and they have all consulted corpora to express findings about language. Same thing with dictionaries. The dictionaries have also been big exploiters of corpora as sources of data. Now, when we're looking for sources of language data, what we need to do is ask 1,000 people. And we can ask 1,000 people not by sending out messages through Facebook saying, how do you use this word and phrase, but by looking at a collection which has been sampled and stored, a collection of authentic language, and through this we can then determine what the patterns and relationships are that will allow us to make predictions and to give students advice. There is a video listed here at the bottom about frequency in language, which will be listed on the final page of this presentation. Now, citizen scientists. This is when you and I can be a scientist without having to be a linguist or a biologist or an astronomer. We can have our own research questions, and we can look at data, and we can come to conclusions, and we can share our conclusions with other people, and we can find out if these things are generally true or not. Now, imagine telling your students that the word handsome is only used for men, and then one of your students says, oh, sorry, I've seen handsome women somewhere. Maybe they've been reading Jane Austen, for example. So you tell your students, well, look, you can say anything in English, which is basically true. You can say anything. The important thing is, as you have trained your student, the student will then say, sorry, sir, do you say handsome woman in English? And then you've got the basis for an inquiry. So this difference between can and do is possible language versus probable language. It's a very worthwhile distinction to make. So the questions we're going to investigate now, or that question, sorry, is hardly going to be found in a grammar book or a dictionary. So our citizen scientists are going to have a look, for example, at SkELL, which is a free online tool that allows anyone to search in this large sample. It's got over 1 billion words of English drawn from the internet. Now, when I typed in handsome man, it told me there were 0.36 hits per million. And since there are 1,000 millions in a billion, there are approximately 360 uses of handsome man in the SkELL corpus. What do you notice in the 5 examples in this screenshot? The 5 examples. We'll have a look at that. What we find is we find words which are related to handsome and related to man. These are important observations, and we'll talk about that. So these are just 5, but in fact every search in SkELL returns 40 example sentences. And sometimes when something is very frequent, like 1,000 hits per million, then it's choosing 40 sentences from a very large sample. And we also notice that it's not only man, but we also see men, because these searches always search for the lemma of the word. So if you're searching for an irregular verb like take, it will search for take, takes, taking, took, and taken. So our question is, do we say handsome woman in English? So we can have a look at handsome woman, and we can see that it's only got 0.06 examples in this corpus. So that means that it's about 60 times in the corpus, which means it exists in the language, certainly, but it's not used as often. And it's not used as often because women aren't typically handsome. However, the answer really lies not in the collocation of handsome man, handsome woman, but in fact what the characteristics of a handsome person are. And if you have a look at, for example, a Google image search, you will see handsome women are quite often older, often tall, look very professional, have short hair. These are the things which are handsome, and they're the sorts of things which are also true for handsome man, because there are many adjectives to describe attractive men and women, and handsome has its own set of characteristics. And if we look in the lines on either side of handsome woman in the 40 examples, we see things like imposing, tall, strikingly, black fur coat, competent, large, tall, very experienced, alluring, tall, good family, remarkably joyous disposition. So this is what we call lexical support. These ideas are ever present in what we call the cotext of sentences. And the cotext is different from context. The cotext is the words and phrases to the left and right, so the immediate context of your search item. Context is a much more general word which may refer to the whole text or the context of the situation in which the text was created. It's a very general word. So this is called lexical support, and asking students to look not only at the example sentences, but asking them specifically to find words to the left and the right of their search for items that support the actual concept is a very useful task. We can also use SkELL to look at connotations. This list of words was generated by SkELL when you choose similar words. It's one of the 3 tools. They are not all lists of synonyms, rather they're words that are used in the same sorts of cotexts. Now you get a different set of similar words when you type in gorgeous, wonderful, beautiful, etc. And I recommend you have a look at that, and of course that's a very good lesson for the students. You'll also get different cotext when you look at the items left and right of gorgeous, wonderful and beautiful, with it's with a man, with it's with a woman. So here's a little challenge. Now, all scientists record their findings, so if your students were making these observations in these example sentences and in the similar words section of SkELL, how would they record them in vocabulary notebooks? So that's a question which I think is really important. Now, I wrote a book earlier this year, published it, called the Versatile Blank Book, and I've been very interested in trying to represent how sounds are stored in our minds and getting students to do so also. Here you can see some of the information and knowledge that can be presented to show the patterns and relationships graphically. The process of creating these is a really strong learning experience, and not only in terms of language learning, but in the processes of clarifying the meanings and the content that they express. So if we want our students to remain productively engaged through their long learning trajectory, activity types that match their linguistic development and maturity are needed to respect their intelligence and sustain their motivation. Such things are best co-created, that is, as group work. And indeed, the teachers on my courses earlier this year did a good deal of co-creating, sometimes online, we're in pandemic period of course. Sometimes they sat together at the academies and they uploaded photos of their creations for their colleagues to critique. Now here's another activity you can use with SkELL, and it also depends on hits per million. Across the top we've got 4 times of day, and down the left we've got words which are often used with these. So the first task is for the students to use their knowledge of English already to mark these. They can use a tick or a cross or a question mark in each cell of the table, and then they can check the combinations in the corpus. So they can look up last morning, last afternoon, last evening, last night to see what the hits per million are, and that gives a very, very good idea and confirms their hunches about them. There are a few exceptions because sometimes a combination here will not be used by itself to express the adverbial, but might be part of a longer phrase where it is acceptable. So the students need to check if they are surprised by any of the hits per million. Collocation chains is another way of using hits per million. In this example, we have a sentence taken from a book, and here we have chunks taken out of that sentence. Then we've looked in a corpus and found out how frequently they occur. And this gives a very good idea. The students get the idea that the language that we string together is chunks of already existing. So you might have noticed on that earlier slide, linguistic hand-me-downs. So we're always using and reusing bits of language that already exist. And sometimes it's better to be not too original because it sounds like a mistake or some form of deviant language. So this is another very good task for students. They learn several things at the same time, of course, not just working this out. When we're correcting written work, we can use this HOE procedure. We can ask students, or as non-native speaking language teachers, we're often presented with language by students and you think, oh, it could be okay, maybe not. So you can use the HOE procedure to have a look for chunks of language to see if they do exist. And it's much better to do this in a program like SkELL or CoCA than in Google, because Google is a good example of what is possible in language, whereas a corpus will tell you what is probable. So these lexical choices that the students make can be checked. Snow clones, these are an interesting little feature of language. We often use them. They're kind of cliches that are used as templates. So they often come from films, television, TV commercials, etc. And if we say to boldly go where, and this is from Star Trek, and many native speakers of English will recognize this, and many sci-fi fans, whether native or not, will recognize to boldly go where no man has gone before. But you will find that people exploit this, and they'll say to boldly go where no scientists have dared experiment before, and they use that structure. So that's called a snow clone. And there are many, many of these in the language. You'll notice on the bottom one here we've got dot star. Now dot star is something that you can put into a SkELL search. So you can type in nothing says dot star like. And dot star will find any word that exists in the corpus in between nothing says and like. So very, very useful is the dot star. Here are a few more examples. Moving now to collocation. One of the problems we have with collocation is its definition. So you might like to pause the video and have a look at these questions and answer them, because with so many definitions of collocation, we need to be sure that we're talking about the same thing. This is always a problem with definitions. Is the speaker and the listener on the same track? So the definition that I work with for several reasons is written here at the top. A collocation is a pair of content words, so we're excluding function words, of different parts of speech. If you put the same part of speech together, then you get a compound noun or a compound preposition or a compound verb, a verb phrase. So different part of speech is an important part of this definition, and they create a single unit of meaning. So here are some examples here. You might like to pause and look at them. The important thing here also is that, as we will see on the next slide, that in being an element of information or an information unit, they are important in structuring sentences. When we look at SkELL's collocations, which we haven't done so far, we've looked at the example sentences and the other words, but here we've got the word sketches. So I've just looked at the word sketch of dolphin here, and what SkELL does is it organizes the collocations into grammatical relationships. So we've got subject, verbs, objects, etc. So when you look at the first column, these are the subjects of when dolphin is the subject of these verbs, swim, watch, have, do. So that tells us what dolphins do. When we've got the verbs where dolphin is the object, that's what people do to dolphins. Spot, train, catch, kill. Then we have modifiers and modified by. So these columns are extremely useful, and I'm sure you can think of some interesting ways your students could represent these visually, as well as actually using them in texts. Another thing we can do with collocations is we can learn more vocabulary and we can choose better vocabulary. As you can see in this text, not very impressive choices have been made. My niece lives in Nice. It was such a nice day that I was in a really nice mood. I even went shopping to buy a nice dress for my nice niece. She lives in a nice part of Nice, not far from a nice beach. So obviously that's a dummy text. And the task for students is obviously to replace nice with appropriate adjectives that go before these nouns. So we're not looking now for synonyms of nice, we're looking for collocations of the words. We're looking for what are some alternatives to nice day, nice mood, nice dress, etc. So if you have a look at the word sketches of day, of mood, of dress, the students will have the opportunity to make some good choices, and they will learn some new vocabulary because there will be words there that they're not familiar with, or they have a passive knowledge of, but might like to promote this to an active knowledge of the vocabulary. Now we're going to have a look at some aspects of grammar. As you can see in this chart, we've got the three auxiliary verbs be, have, and do, and when they combine with various forms of verbs, they create these verb structures or these sentence structures as you wish. So we can search for these. It's one of the nice things about using SkELL and ***, which I mentioned before. So if we want to find examples of the perfect aspect, then we can go have **ed. So this will find any form of have. Remember, it searches for the lemma. So it will find have, has, having. It will also find past, had, plus past participle. So it will give you the present perfect and the past perfect. It will give you the future perfect, having something. So that can be very useful. We can go have been **ing. That will look for perfect continuous structures. And you can look for a conditional structure, which is not represented in this verb chart. When you do, it takes us back to these visible patterns we were talking about earlier. And these are just 10 examples of each of these, but as I said before, you get 40 examples of each. So these can be very useful, and you might, instead of using **ed or **ing, you might choose a specific verb that you are focusing on in your teaching to look for specific examples of present continuous with an ing form. So there are plenty of tasks that we can do with these, although I've pretty well hinted at some already. So when you're looking at the 40 sentences, you can read them and answer teachers' questions about the structures. So a very good observation task there once the students are looking at it. They can compare the form and function of the structure in relation to their first language or first languages. You can copy some examples onto a worksheet without the colouring, because that's a bit of a giveaway. So what do the students notice? The students can also look at the sentences and think of real-world contexts for them, and then write a sentence that would logically go before or after. It's quite challenging, actually. Discuss the genre and register that the sentences come from. This is particularly interesting in the handsome woman examples, where when you have a look at the full page on SkELL, you get a very Jane Austen period feeling for the language. Students perform the searches, but replace some of the *** with likely words. And you can also chop the sentences into words, and the students have to reorder them. So word order is often a very good thing. You might chop them into individual words, or you might chop the sentences into chunks. And then when you've got your chunks, you might then do the Hoey procedure and do that process as well to find out how frequent specific chunks are in the language. So a summary so far, we're talking about patterns of normal usage in a large sample of the whole language. We're talking about language discovery, so students are finding patterns in the language. We're using authentic examples for a variety of purposes. We're talking about creating notebooks that show patterns and relationships. We're answering questions and solving problems. And the students can find can be quite highly motivated when they're looking for these patterns and relationships. So there's a great deal of learning that can take place. We know that dictionaries and grammar books cannot do everything. We know also that SkELL contains a lot of unedited rubbish. So teachers, you need to be careful when you're putting up live example pages to your students. And one of the things I'd like to really mention at this stage, to lead into the next section, is that the 40 sentences in a SkELL page don't have any discourse relationship. Every one of them comes from a different text. So, when you're working with your students, which of these vocabulary activities do you do, and which of them relate to discovery learning? So, if you'd like to pause the video and answer that question, you will probably agree, as the people in the webinar did, that none of these are really related to discovery learning. True or false? These activities are suitable for learners of all ages, at all stages, with various learning needs and studying language for academic purposes. And the answer to that question is false. They are not. They're all useful, real-world language teaching activities that we do, but they are not always suitable for everyone in every learning situation. And when you look at published textbooks, even for advanced level students, you see that these sorts of activities are still being done. And this little quote is attributed to Einstein, but many are. Who knows who really said it? Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So I'm referring particularly here to learners who get to a certain stage and need to get off their learning plateau. And you know, like at B2 level going up to C1, it can be quite difficult for students to find ways of getting off that plateau. They're just sort of sitting there and they're not really getting better. So one thing we can do is come up with much more sophisticated learning activities, such as the ones we've been talking about up to this point, and some of the ones that we're about to see. I don't know if you're familiar with this comment, but it was made in the 1970s by Arthur C. Clarke. At the time, education was actually focused on filling students' minds with information, at a time when computers were showing their potential to be useful sources of information. Now, this was in the days when we spoke of IT, but now we speak of ICT, and the C makes a huge amount of difference. For decades now, we no longer believe that education is a process of pouring information into people's heads. For teachers and students to incorporate new findings into their thinking, they need to learn about these things from multiple sources in various formats and engage in considerable critical and creative thinking. So, as we acquire new data and information from our 5 senses, or 6 if you've got 6th sense, from books and friends and the internet and the press, and from our more knowledgeable others, as Vygotsky had it, and from the specific observations we make, these things hook into the information or hook onto the information we already have. And they reshape our information, which means that information, all of the information we hold, is in a constant state of flux. And as it forms new relationships in our minds and influences how we understand the world and how we function in it, new knowledge is created. Knowledge is of course a very subjective and personal feature of every individual. So in our language study, our data is language, authentic language. It's text. As we structure the data, we sort it and find patterns in it, it converts into information. And we're doing this all the time, every day in our lives. And as all of this information gets organized into mental models, theories and schemas, we arrive at some sort of conceptual knowledge. Our models and schemas enable us to use these features of language. This is procedural knowledge. In learning language from language, students also learn how to use text as data. This is another aspect of their procedural knowledge. And as students become more aware of their learning, their metacognitive knowledge also develops in concert with these procedures. So students learn to notice, but we first need to prepare their minds. Otherwise, they don't know what there is to notice. So we're moving now to a more specific type of corpus, a corpus of one text only. Now, what if you could teach any text you like? Who would choose the texts? What would the students gain from exploring the content and the language at the same time? Would discourse features become another layer for language discovery? And what roles would the students' knowledge of the world play? Now, these are very important questions when we're choosing single texts to work with. They're not things which are in course books where everything has been pre-processed for a global market. We're now talking about creating personalized materials which may only be useful at the moment because of some current affairs, for example. So, in this hierarchy of language, which we won't spend a lot of time talking about now, we see in the middle the hierarchy of language, which is quite well known, and we see how the four systems, which are vocabulary, grammar, functional language, and pronunciation, relate to the hierarchy of language. And the black line going from text to the four skills indicates that when we're working at the top of the hierarchy of language, we are essentially doing skills work. Now, skills work, text work is always influenced by register and genre, and the choices we make in grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation and functional language are, in fact, related to, or to some extent, dictated or constrained by register and genre. So it's very important to link these things together. The brown arrows indicate top-down and bottom-up learning. So the left one is when we're working with texts and we're looking at how the text works, and we talk about the schema of the texts. Then this is top-down learning. When we're working with language from the bottom up, we're working with the four systems. We're looking at the grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation and functional language to see how these things can be put together to create a text. So this is top down and bottom up. And in our skills lessons, we can do top down and bottom up activities before the main task. And after a task, we can also do top down and bottom up activities. This is a standard plan for skills lessons. So we're now going to have a look at the program called VersaText, which works with one text at a time. It has 4 pages. The website has 4 pages. A whole text can be represented in a word cloud, which is really customizable. And then the words in the text can be shown in a concordance in various formats. And the words are also classified in various ways in the word profiler. The word profiler describes the whole text in a range of lexical statistics and lists. So we're going to have a look now at VersaText. So this is a text. So we have our text. We put the text into this input field, and then we make a word cloud of it, and the word cloud can be customized, as we'll see. And the third stage is you click on a word and you see that word in the concordance, and then the word profiler shows us various lexical statistics, which many teachers find useful when they're making decisions about texts. So this program can be found on the web at versatext.versatile.pub, and you will see here below the input field 20 texts. Those on the left are general, authentic texts. Those on the right are graded readers. And you will see all of the texts have their CEFR estimates beside them, which the profiler has done. So when you've got a word cloud of a text that you've chosen in class, you can ask your students to look at it long before they see the actual text and ask them questions to predict what the text is going to be like. You can stop the video and have a look at this if you wish, these specific questions. And when you show them the word cloud which has got all of the parts of speech in it, this has got 100 words in it, then you can deal also with genre and register questions. Another task we do is a pronunciation activity. We ask the students to look at the word cloud and copy some of the words into the cells like this. So you can see that curbed is a one-syllable word, hazard is a two-syllable word with the stress on the first, prediction is a three-syllable word with the stress on the second. So that's where the students position the words. There's a video and a web page which you can have a look at later. Another thing that we can do with text is identify the topic trails. Now, every text represents 3 or 4 or 5 topics. This one I identified 4 topics in, and you can ask the students to look at a text, ask them to use a different highlighting pen to identify or to mark the words that represent the trail. So that's a topic trail task. And we can also do the same task with a word cloud. You can identify the topics in a text, and the students can then find the words in the word cloud which represent the topics. And one of the things that the students can then do with their topic trails is that they can make this nice spray diagram, and that's a nice learning activity that they can do, make a poster of if they're working in groups to display in the classroom, or they can do this in their learning journals, then vocabulary notebooks, and it's something which makes quite good homework as well. If you're looking for creative, motivating, interesting homework that the students can do with a text or even a word cloud before they come to class. So that's kind of implying the flipped classroom model there. Lexical cohesion is the use of words which are related to each other that run through a text. And in this particular word cloud, we have these words: decide, choose, make, build, win, achieve, fail, invent, create, etc. These words create lexical cohesion, and it's a very nice task for students to find words. You might like to give them the word on the left and ask them to find something in the right, something in the word cloud that is in some way semantically related to the words that you've given on the left. If we put our topic trails in columns instead of that spray diagram we just looked at, but in columns, then you can also identify the lexical cohesion within a topic trail, not just within the word cloud representing the whole text, but just within a topic trail. Very, very instructive, interesting exercise, and this was this is some board work I did with some EMI teachers, so not linguists, but they were at an engineering faculty in China. So you don't have to be a linguist to be able to be guided by a teacher to find related words like that. So we're talking now about all of these things which function at the full text level. And we're going to move on to look at some aspects of grammar and vocabulary now. One of the very important things is this idea that grammar and vocabulary are not two separate entities, but are two ends of a continuum. And this is something we particularly associate with the linguist Michael Halliday. So here you can see that, for example, word templates and colligation and hypernyms, they're not specifically grammar and they're not specifically vocabulary, they're somewhere in the middle. So it's a very interesting way to think about language, and it's a very true, a very genuine fact that language does work like that, not just as separate entities. Now, morphology, an obvious aspect of language study, deals with the forms of words, and we've got deviation on the left and we've got derivation on the left and word formation on the right. And when students are tasked with finding words in a text, they can put them into this shape here. So in the top they would write the word that they're focusing on, and then they would look at the conjugations, declensions, the compounding and the derivations which go in here. And this is a nice way for them to develop their awareness of this, and it's quite well documented in second language acquisition literature that one of the problems students have is with word forms, even at the most advanced levels. Colligation is another very important feature of a word, a property of a word. It's the grammatical relationships which they form. And a lot of textbooks deal with the patterns that verbs form, but forget or ignore the fact that these also work just as importantly with nouns and adjectives. So you can see in the top row here we've got nouns, verbs and adjectives that are typically followed by the to infinitive, and then some that are followed by the that clause. A very, very important thing for students to be aware of, and once they are aware of it, then they can be tasked with discovering it in texts and adding this new finding of their own into their learning journals, and of course using them in productive activities. Grammar patterns take colligation one step further. They look a bit like this. It, verb, that. Verb, noun, for, noun. Adjective as to WH words. So a vast proportion of the vocabulary works in grammar patterns, especially nouns, verbs and adjectives. And once the students know this, they can start observing the patterns for themselves with the keywords in their fields, the keywords in their topics that they need to know. This is one example of a verb pattern, the verb about noun. And there are three structures that it works in. These are in blue. And the middle structure has got three semantic groups. So there are a set of verbs in English which are to do with talking, which are followed by about noun. Argue, whisper, rabbit on. There's also a set of verbs to do with thinking in this structure and a set of verbs to do with learning in this structure. Now, as I said, a great deal of the language works in this way, so it would be a shame not to deal with these things in our teaching. When we're looking at our concordances, we can make these observations, and this is exactly what the students need to be able to learn how to do. Another task that students can do, which is related to the code text we were speaking about before, is that they can find the words to the left and right of the target word of a concordance and identify the words which have some sort of relationship with the. Then they can create this word constellation, which is a very nice way of students really focusing on a word and learning about the word. So if they're dealing in CLIL or ESP or EMI with specific topic words for their field or for a subfield in a particular text, this is a nice activity that students can be encouraged to do so that this word is promoted to their active vocabulary. Another thing which which VersaText has is the opportunity to make clouds not of words but of grammar information. So you can make a word cloud of parts of speech, but you can also make a tag cloud. And a tag is a 2, 3 or 4 letter code that indicates not just the part of speech but the type of part of speech. So here you'll see NNS, that means plural noun, or MD is a modal verb, or RB is an adverb, or JJS is a superlative adjective. So when you look at those things in particular, you can see there can be some very good grammar or vocabulary work that can take place there. So those are in the word cloud. In the word profiler, you also have all of the words listed in their parts of speech, also subcategorized into their frequency bands. So you can click on any of the words in the word profiler to see them in a concordance. And on the next slide, you'll see that I've clicked on preposition in the part of speech cloud. And these are all of the, well, in fact, this is an excerpt of all of the prepositions in a particular article, which is one of the sample texts on the input page. And prepositions, I'm particularly interested in prepositions because they are so problematic. And part of the problem is that they are often regarded as grammar and they are often regarded as vocabulary when some are one and some are the other in different contexts. So what I've done here is I've taken a lot of chunks of language from this concordance and structured them according to how they function as prepositions. So not all of them are prepositions, and that's one of the problems. So some of them are particles, some of them belong to phrasal verbs, and some are bound prepositions and free prepositions, and they're the real prepositions, and some of them are part of phrase structures. So helping students to develop some understanding of what prepositions are and aren't is a very good start in helping them to learn about prepositions and to solve some of the problems that people have with prepositions. When I clicked on the tag VVD, as you can see in the top left here, tag equals VVD, it gave me these particular verbs in the text that I was looking at. This is the text about the extreme weather. Quite interestingly, most of them are used for reported speech. So there's an instant lesson for observation tasks. If we look at just the adjectives, make a word cloud of just the adjectives in a text, then we can make these sorts of observations that I've got here on the left. You might like to pause the video and see those questions. And similarly with adverbs. If something is happening again and again and again, then it seems to imply something annoying. And if you find that a significant set of words have the same semantics, like carefully, urgently, immediately, and suddenly, then it's telling you something about the text even before you read it. So these are all sorts of tasks that the students can be led to perform and learn through their discoveries. So what we're talking about taking a text, making a word cloud out of it, and we've seen many different tasks and questions which can be asked of different types of word clouds. We can identify the topic trails in the text. We can look at the paradigmatic relationships, and paradigmatic refers to things such as synonyms, antonyms, hyponyms, homonyms, meronyms. We can find those as we were doing when we had the topic trails listed on the blackboard. And we can also look at the syntagmatic relationships, the most important being collocation and colligation. And we can put these together to form word templates, which are structures around key words in a text. So that brings to an end the discussion. I'd now like to point out that there is a new e-learning course for learning how to use, in all these sorts of ways, VersaText. And if you'd like to have a look at this course, go to my Moodle site, moodle.versatile.pub, click on New here, and that will take you to some information about the course, and if you want to join it, you can fill in the form there. There is also a Kindle book which contains a lot of information which is in the e-learning course, except that it doesn't have the interactive tasks that teachers do together, and you can read a lot of the details that I've mentioned in this presentation already about VersaText. So here's the introductory slide again. The webinars webpage is from the versatile.pub site, and just have a look at CorpusCALL webinar, and it has links to all of the things which I've mentioned. If you need to contact me, there is in the footer of my website a contact button. So thank you for your attention. That was just over 50 minutes, a little bit longer than I'd expected. I hope you have survived. Thank you.